The village had been exactly as I'd imagined, tucked away in a remote, windswept part of Ireland, its slate roofs peeking out from a thick morning mist. I'd been drawn here for as long as I could remember, driven by an insatiable curiosity for the old Celtic legends, the stories of Samhain and the ghosts of the past. There was something different about Irish folklore compared to others I'd studied. It was raw and unfiltered, a blend of nature's mystery and ancient whispers that could rattle your very soul. Halloween in Ireland, I had read, was more than costumes and candy. It was a portal to another world, a world where the dead and the living could cross paths. And Samhain? It was supposed to be the thinnest time of year, when even the cautious would stay indoors for fear that something or someone might slip through that veil. After settling into a small inn that looked as old as the hills themselves, I spent the first few days exploring the village. There was an odd stillness in the air, an unnatural quiet. The people here were friendly, but they seemed wary, glancing over their shoulders if the sun dipped too low, even if they wouldn't admit it aloud. It felt like I was walking through an invisible fog of secrets, an unspoken tension that everyone knew about but never discussed. I began asking around about local legends. When the villagers found out I'd come to see the Samhain festival and explore the woods, their reactions were subtle but unmistakable. I could see the shifts in posture, a tightening of expressions, a quick exchange of glances. Most people simply smiled politely and avoided answering directly, moving the conversation toward safer ground. One old woman, however, pulled me aside as I was wandering near a small graveyard behind the church. Her face was lined with years and wisdom, her eyes a piercing gray that felt like they could see straight through you. She didn't say much at first, only that it wasn't wise to go looking for answers in the woods, especially around Halloween. "There's an energy out there," she murmured, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Something that doesn't take kindly to outsiders. Or even us, truth be told." When I pressed her for more, she only shook her head, her fingers tracing a worn pendant around her neck. "Some things don't want to be disturbed," she finally said, fixing me with a gaze so intense that I almost felt a chill ripple through me. Despite her warning, my curiosity grew stronger. I told myself it was just folklore, old stories meant to scare children into behaving. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake her words. They echoed in my mind, blending with the rustle of the wind outside my window. There was something about that place, those woods. It was like they were alive, pulsing with an energy I couldn't quite understand. I decided that, folklore or not, I had to see it for myself. When I finally ventured out into the woods the following night, it was already nearing dusk. The air was thick and cool, scented with damp earth and fallen leaves. It was the kind of atmosphere that made every sound sharper, every shadow longer. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisted and reaching out like skeletal hands, their shapes distorted in the fading light. I felt a strange combination of excitement and unease, the thrill of exploration mixed with the faintest twinge of dread. The path wound deeper into the woods, narrowing until it was little more than a trail carved out by animals or previous wanderers. The deeper I went, the quieter everything seemed to grow, as if the trees themselves were swallowing up any sound that dared to emerge. I strained my ears, trying to catch anything, a rustle of leaves, a bird, even the distant hum of the village behind me. But there was only silence, thick and heavy, pressing down on me from all sides. As I walked, I began to notice strange carvings on some of the trees. Symbols, crude and ancient-looking, as if someone had etched them into the bark with trembling hands. I couldn't recognize them, but something about them felt wrong, like they weren't meant to be seen or understood. I touched one of the carvings lightly, running my fingers over its rough edges, and felt an almost electric jolt. A shiver ran down my spine, and I pulled my hand back quickly, heart pounding. It was silly, I told myself, just nerves. But the sense of unease deepened. The trees seemed to close in tighter around me, and the light grew dimmer, casting shadows that danced and flickered in ways that felt unnatural, as if they had lives of their own. I tried to shake off the feeling, but every time I looked over my shoulder, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching me. My footsteps seemed louder than they should have been, echoing through the silence in a way that was almost accusatory, like I was intruding where I didn't belong. Then I heard it. Faint at first, so quiet that I almost dismissed it as my imagination. A soft whisper, drifting through the trees just out of reach. It didn't sound like a voice exactly, more like a breath on the wind, a sound that carried with it a sense of longing, of something old and forgotten. I stopped, straining to listen, but the whisper faded, replaced by an uneasy silence that felt somehow worse. I tried to continue on, chalking up the sounds and sensations to the eeriness of the woods at dusk. But just as I was starting to relax, I heard another sound, this time unmistakable. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, crunching leaves underfoot, a steady rhythm that matched my own. I froze, heart pounding, listening as the footsteps came closer, then paused as if whoever, or whatever, was out there had stopped just behind me. I didn't dare turn around. My mind raced with possibilities. Another traveler, a villager playing a prank, maybe even a lost animal. But deep down, I knew it was none of those. The atmosphere had shifted, grown heavy with something darker, something ancient. I could feel it in the air, a presence that pressed against me, making it hard to breathe. As I stood there, paralyzed with fear, the footsteps began again, circling me slowly, deliberately, as if studying me. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, a cold sweat prickling my skin. I wanted to run, to get out of those woods as fast as possible, but my feet felt rooted to the spot, as if the earth itself was holding me in place. In that moment, I remembered the old woman's warning, her words echoing in my mind. Some things don't want to be disturbed. I'd laughed it off then, but now, in the thick of that silent, oppressive darkness, I understood what she meant. This was no ordinary place, and whatever lurked in the shadows was no ordinary presence. I could feel it, an ancient, restless energy that radiated from the very earth beneath my feet. I stood there, heart pounding, barely daring to breathe, waiting for whatever was out there to reveal itself. But there was only silence, thick and impenetrable, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the presence was gone, slipping back into the shadows, leaving me alone once more in the darkening woods. I knew then that the warnings had been real, that the tales of Samhain and the spirits that roamed these woods were more than just stories. And though I'd come searching for a glimpse of the unknown, I found myself wishing with every ounce of my being that I had heeded the warnings and never set foot in those woods. The further I walked, the thicker the mist became, creeping through the trees like something alive, curling and swirling in strange, unnatural patterns. It clung to the ground, rising in soft tendrils that wrapped around my ankles and seemed to pull me deeper, guiding me away from the main path until I had no idea where I was anymore. The mist blurred everything, twisting familiar shapes into haunting shadows, masking the trees until they looked like dark, towering figures watching from all sides. I felt a sudden wave of panic, realizing I was no longer sure of the way back. I tried to retrace my steps, but every direction looked the same, cloaked in that impenetrable fog. My mind raced with excuses. Fog like this wasn't uncommon in Ireland, I told myself. It was just a matter of keeping calm, of picking one direction and sticking to it. But the trees around me felt like they were shifting, closing in tighter with every step I took. The air grew colder, damp with the scent of wet earth and decay. I wrapped my arms around myself, wishing for warmth, for the security of the village lights. But I had ventured too far, and they were nowhere in sight. Then came the sounds, and at first it was barely audible, just a soft whisper that seemed to drift through the trees. I stopped, straining to listen, but the whisper faded, leaving behind only the eerie silence that now pressed down around me. I began to walk faster, my footsteps crunching on the wet leaves beneath me, hoping the sound would ground me, reassure me that I was still moving forward. But the more I walked, the louder the whispers became. They were all around me now, a soft chorus that echoed through the mist, a strange, haunting melody that felt as if it was coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. It didn't take long before the whispers started forming words, or something that resembled words. They were faint, broken, slipping through my grasp as soon as I tried to catch them. like voices from a dream slipping through my mind as I woke. But there was something chilling about them, a cadence that didn't feel human. It was like the woods themselves were speaking, calling to me, weaving words into the mist. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it was the wind, the trick of my imagination, but deep down I knew it wasn't. A sudden shape in the fog made me jump, my heart pounding as I squinted through the haze. It looked like a figure, tall and thin, standing just on the edge of my vision. I blinked, trying to focus, but as soon as I did, it melted back into the mist. My breath came faster, shallow and ragged. It felt like something was playing with me, taunting me, knowing I couldn't see it clearly. I began to walk again, faster this time, almost running. But the mist only thickened, blurring everything, drawing me further into its depths. As I stumbled over roots and rocks, I heard laughter, soft, barely there, but unmistakable. It was a strange sound, hollow and empty, like the laughter of someone who had long forgotten what it felt like to be alive. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest, every instinct telling me to run. But there was nowhere to run to. The laughter echoed around me, distorted and warped, bouncing off the trees, so that I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I told myself it was just the woods, that I was letting my mind play tricks on me. But even as I thought it, I could feel a presence closing in, a sense of something watching me from the shadows, something old and hungry. The air was thick with a strange energy, a force that pulsed through the ground beneath my feet, like the heartbeat of something lying dormant, waiting. I could almost feel it, the steady rhythm of something ancient, something beyond understanding. The laughter faded, replaced by a low guttural sound, a growl maybe, or something even stranger, something that didn't belong to any animal I'd ever heard. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like lead, heavy and rooted to the spot. The air grew colder, the mist thickening until I could barely see my own hand in front of my face, and then out of the fog I saw it again, a figure shadowed and indistinct, moving through the mist. This time it was closer, close enough that I could see the outline of its face, or what should have been a face. Instead, there was only darkness, a hollow void that seemed to suck in the light, to absorb it like a black hole. I took a step back, stumbling over a root, my heart pounding as the figure took a step toward me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, paralyzed by the sight of it, by the darkness that seemed to pulse from its form. The whispers grew louder, filling the air with a strange, rhythmic chant that seemed to come from the figure, though its mouth, or where its mouth should have been, never moved. It was as if the words were coming from the mist itself, from the trees, from the very ground beneath my feet. I closed my eyes, squeezing them shut, willing myself to wake up, to believe this was all a nightmare, some twisted vision brought on by exhaustion. But when I opened them, the figure was still there, closer now, its hollow gaze fixed on me. And then, in a moment of pure terror, I saw its hand reach out from the mist, stretching toward me. It was long and thin, skeletal, its fingers twisting and curling in unnatural angles. I stumbled back, my mind racing with panic, with the desperate urge to flee. But the ground seemed to shift beneath me, the roots twisting and writhing like snakes, wrapping around my ankles, holding me in place. I struggled, pulling at my feet, but the roots only tightened, as if they were alive, as if they wanted to keep me there, to draw me deeper into the earth. The whispers were all around me now, a cacophony of voices that filled the air, pressing down on me, suffocating me with their weight. I could feel them in my mind, crawling through my thoughts, filling my head with images of darkness and decay, of shadows stretching through endless forests, of faces twisted in agony, lost to time and memory. It was as if the very soul of the woods had seeped into me, binding me to its ancient, restless spirit. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The whispers faded, the figure melted back into the mist, and the roots loosened their grip, slipping away as if they had never been there. I stumbled forward, gasping for breath, my heart racing as I looked around, but there was nothing. The mist had thinned, the trees standing silent and still, as if the woods had returned to their natural state, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I could still feel it, the strange energy that lingered in the air, the echoes of those whispers that seemed to haunt the silence. I knew then that I was no longer alone in those woods, that something had found me, something that had been waiting, watching, hidden in the shadows. And though I couldn't see it, I could feel it. A presence that hovered just beyond my sight, a darkness that had seeped into my bones, that would stay with me long after I left those woods, and I didn't know what it wanted, didn't understand what I had seen, but I knew one thing for certain. I was in a place where I didn't belong, a place where the line between the living and the dead was thin, too thin, and as I stumbled through the mist, desperate to find my way out, I could feel it following me, a shadow that would haunt me, that would linger in my mind, a reminder of the darkness that lay hidden in the heart of those woods. The darkness had grown so thick around me that I could barely see my own hands in front of my face. My phone battery was draining fast, the faint glow flickering with every step I took, like it was struggling to keep me grounded in reality. I'd been stumbling through the mist, trying to retrace my steps, but every turn I made seemed to pull me further off course, deeper into the unknown. The trees loomed larger now, pressing in like towering specters, their branches twisted in unnatural shapes that reached out, almost brushing my shoulders as I passed. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, just shadows playing tricks on my mind. But there was something wrong with the air itself, as if it held a weight, a pulse, something ancient and alive. The silence around me felt unnatural, thick and oppressive, and with every step I took, I felt that presence growing stronger, watching, waiting. Just as I was about to turn back in desperation, hoping to stumble onto the path by sheer luck, I saw it. A faint glow in the distance, barely visible through the mist. My heart leapt at the sight, a glimmer of hope piercing the darkness. Maybe someone else was out here, maybe it was a light from the village, or even another traveler with a flashlight. I picked up my pace, moving toward the glow, feeling an odd sense of relief as I grew closer. The light grew brighter, warmer, flickering like fire, and I thought I could even feel a bit of warmth on my face, a small break from the biting cold. But as I drew closer, I realized it wasn't the comforting light of a campfire or flashlight. The glow was coming from a ring of stones arranged in a perfect circle, their surfaces covered in strange ancient symbols that seemed to shimmer and pulse with an otherworldly light. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching, as I took in the sight before me. This wasn't some casual gathering place, some harmless relic left behind by people from the past. This was a place of power, of ritual, and it was waiting for something, or someone. Standing at the center of the stone circle was a figure cloaked in dark robes, hood pulled low, their face obscured by shadows. The figure stood motionless, as if they'd been expecting me, as if they'd sensed my approach long before I'd arrived. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat loud and frantic, drowning out every other thought. I knew I should turn around, that I should leave as quietly as I'd come, but I couldn't move. Something about that figure held me in place, as if they'd cast a spell over me. I watched, frozen, as the figure began to move, their arms lifting slowly, stretching out to either side as if embracing the air around them. The light from the stones seemed to pulse in time with their movements, glowing brighter, casting strange shadows across the clearing that danced and twisted like living things. And then I heard it, a low, droning chant, barely more than a whisper, but powerful, resonating through the air like a vibration that settled deep into my bones. The sound wasn't coming from the figure alone. It was as if the very stones themselves were singing, their voices melding with the figure's chant in a strange, haunting melody. I felt it reverberate through me, pulling at something deep within, something primal and ancient that I didn't understand. It was hypnotic, drawing me in, making it impossible to look away. As I watched, the figure turned slowly, their hooded face tilting up, and I caught a glimpse of what lay beneath. My stomach dropped, a wave of cold terror washing over me. There was no face. Where the face should have been was nothing but darkness, a void that seemed to swallow the light, a shadow that pulsed and writhed as if it were alive. And yet, I felt its gaze upon me, as though it were looking straight into my soul. stripping away every layer, every defense, leaving me exposed and vulnerable. I wanted to scream, to run, to get as far away from that place as possible, but I couldn't move. I was trapped, held in place by some unseen force that bound me to that spot, forcing me to bear witness. The figure raised a hand, pointing in my direction, and a voice filled my mind. Not a voice that I could hear with my ears, but a presence that slipped into my thoughts, twisting around them like a vine. "You should not be here," it said, the words echoing in my mind, filling every corner of my consciousness with an unshakable dread. "This is not your world, not your place. Leave, if you can." The voice wasn't angry, it wasn't even hostile. It was ancient, calm, and terrifyingly indifferent, as if it was speaking from a place beyond time, beyond human understanding. And that indifference was what made it so chilling. I was nothing to it, a mere trespasser who had stumbled into something far greater, far older than myself. It was giving me a choice, a warning, a chance to escape. But I had the sickening feeling that it was too late. I forced myself to take a step back, every nerve in my body screaming for me to run, but as I moved, the light from the stones flared, blinding and intense, and I felt a wave of energy wash over me, pushing me to the ground. My hands scraped against the cold earth as I fell, my mind reeling, disoriented, as the chanting grew louder, filling my senses until I could think of nothing else. Through the blinding light, I caught a glimpse of something moving in the shadows, shapes that writhed and twisted around the edge of the clearing, figures that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. They were watching, waiting, their eyes glinting with a hunger that sent chills down my spine. I knew then that I was surrounded, trapped in the center of something I couldn't comprehend, something that defied the very fabric of reality. The chanting reached a crescendo, the voices rising higher and higher, blending into a single piercing note that seemed to cut through the air like a blade. I pressed my hands over my ears, desperate to block it out, but it was everywhere, vibrating through me, resonating in my bones, in my very soul. I could feel myself slipping, losing touch with everything I knew, with who I was. It was as if the chant was pulling me into the earth itself, drawing me into that dark void, that endless empty place where nothing existed but the ancient power that lay within those stones. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The light faded, the chanting ceased, and the clearing fell into an unnatural silence, as though the world itself was holding its breath. I lay there, trembling, too afraid to move, too terrified to open my eyes. I could still feel the presence around me, that heavy, suffocating energy that pressed down on me, filling the air with a sense of dread that made it impossible to breathe. Slowly, I forced myself to open my eyes, half expecting to see the figure standing over me, waiting to claim me. But the clearing was empty. The stones lay silent and dark, their strange symbols barely visible in the dim light. The mist had lifted, the shadows receded, and the woods looked almost normal again, as if nothing had happened, as if the whole thing had been a twisted, feverish dream. But I knew better, and I could still feel it, the darkness that lingered in the air, the echo of that voice in my mind, the weight of those eyes that had stared into my soul. I staggered to my feet, my legs shaking as I tried to make sense of what I'd just experienced, but there was no explanation, no logic that could contain it. I had come face to face with something beyond understanding, something that had existed long before me and would continue long after I was gone. I stumbled back through the trees, the path a blur as I moved on instinct, desperate to put as much distance as possible between myself and that stone circle. I could feel the weight of the woods around me, the oppressive silence that seemed to follow me, the shadows that flickered at the edges of my vision. And though I didn't look back, I knew it was still there, waiting, watching, a darkness that would haunt me for the rest of my life. As I finally broke free of the woods, the faint lights of the village came into view, a beacon of safety that seemed almost surreal after what I had just witnessed. But even as I reached the edge of the trees, I could feel it, that presence lingering just out of sight, a reminder that I had ventured into a place I didn't belong, that I had seen something I was never meant to see. And as I made my way back to the village, trembling and shaken, I knew that no matter how far I ran, No matter how many miles lay between me and that stone circle, that darkness would follow me, would haunt me, a shadow that had slipped into my mind, into my soul, leaving a part of itself inside me, a part that would never let me go. I don't remember the walk back to the village. My mind was a tangled mess of fear, disbelief, and exhaustion, all of it blurring together into a nightmarish haze. I was running on pure instinct, every nerve still electrified by what I had just witnessed. The cold night air stung my skin as I stumbled through the fields and back along the narrow trail that led to the village. I could hear my own breathing, sharp and ragged, echoing in my ears, mixing with the pounding of my heart. Every step felt heavy, as if I were moving through a dream, a surreal, lingering terror that felt too vivid to be imagined. When I finally reached the edge of the village, the lights looked soft, hazy, almost too warm to be real. I felt as though I were seeing it through a fog, as if I were still trapped in that strange mist from the woods. My body was trembling uncontrollably, my hands cold and numb, my clothes damp and clinging to me like a second skin. I wanted to scream, to shout, to tell someone, anyone, what I'd seen, but the words stuck in my throat. I knew no one would believe me, even I wasn't sure I believed it myself. I don't remember much of what happened after I staggered into the village. A few faces turned toward me, their expressions shifting from curiosity to concern as they took in my appearance. I must have looked like a ghost myself, pale and hollow-eyed, stumbling forward with a wild, desperate look. Someone, maybe the innkeeper, maybe a villager, took me by the arm, leading me back to the small inn where I was staying. I could hear their voice, low and soothing, asking me if I was all right, if I'd been hurt, but I couldn't respond. My mind was still trapped in that clearing, haunted by the image of that figure, that void where a face should have been. When I finally collapsed onto the bed in my room, I thought I would fall into a deep, dreamless sleep. But the second I closed my eyes, the visions came rushing back. Flashes of that chanting, the blinding light, the feel of the earth shifting beneath me as if it were alive. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, my mind racing, replaying every moment, every detail, trying to make sense of it. But there was no sense to be made, no explanation that fit within the bounds of reality. I had seen something that defied logic, something that belonged to another world, and it had left a mark on me, a darkness that I could still feel pulsing beneath my skin. The next morning, I forced myself out of bed, feeling hollow and drained, as if a part of me had been left behind in those woods. I wandered through the village in a daze, hoping that the bright light of day would banish the shadows that clung to me, that the warmth of the sun would dispel the chill that had settled deep into my bones. But the sunlight did little to comfort me. Instead, it seemed to cast everything in a stark, unforgiving light, reminding me that what I had seen was real, that it hadn't been some fevered hallucination or a trick of the darkness. I found myself drawn to the small church at the edge of the village, a simple stone building with a modest graveyard behind it. I thought that maybe I would find some kind of solace there, a place to clear my mind, to ground myself. But as I wandered among the graves, reading the worn inscriptions, I felt only a deep, unsettling sense of sadness. The villagers' faces seemed to blur in my memory, merging with the shadows of the woods, their voices fading into the whispers that still echoed in my mind. As I stood there, lost in thought, an elderly man approached me, his gaze sharp and perceptive. He was one of the villagers I had seen before, but I hadn't spoken to him. His eyes were a startling shade of blue, clear and piercing, as if they could see straight into me, into the terror that still clung to me like a shadow. He must have seen the look in my eyes, the haunted expression that I couldn't hide, because he placed a gentle hand on my shoulder and led me to a bench near the edge of the graveyard. "You saw them, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low and somber. It wasn't a question, not really. It was as if he already knew the answer, as if he had been waiting for me to come to him. I nodded, unable to speak, my throat tight with a mixture of fear and relief. Somehow he knew. Somehow he understood. The man nodded slowly, his gaze distant, as if he were remembering something from long ago. "You're not the first to wander into those woods," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. And you won't be the last. The spirit's there. They don't take kindly to strangers." He paused, studying my face, as if gauging how much I could handle. "You've been touched by them. I can see it. They've left their mark on you." His words sent a chill down my spine, a confirmation of what I had feared all along. The darkness that I had felt, the sense of being watched, of being drawn into something beyond my control. It was real. It had happened, and there was no escaping it. I asked him if there was anything I could do, some way to rid myself of the feeling that clung to me, but he only shook his head, his expression grave. "Once they've seen you, once you've crossed that line and there's no going back," he said softly. "You carry them with you now, whether you like it or not. They'll be with you, in the shadows, in the quiet moments, always just beyond your sight." He looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant hills, his voice heavy with a sorrow that seemed to stretch back through time. "But you're still here. You made it out. That's more than most can say." His words offered little comfort, but there was a strange sense of acceptance in them, a quiet acknowledgement of the forces that lay beyond human understanding. He told me that the woods had always been a place of mystery, a place where the boundaries between worlds were thin, where spirits roamed freely, especially during Samhain. He spoke of ancient rituals, of sacrifices and offerings made to appease the spirits, to keep them from crossing over into our world. "But sometimes," he said, his voice barely a murmur, "sometimes they come anyway, drawn by those who are curious, those who seek answers they aren't ready to hear." As he spoke, I felt a strange sense of clarity, a realization that what I had experienced was something beyond my control, something I could never fully understand. I had crossed into their world, even if only for a moment, and I had been marked by it. And though I knew I would never return to those woods, I understood that they would stay with me, a part of me that I could never shake. That night, as I lay in bed, the memories came rushing back, sharper and more vivid than ever. The whispers, the chanting, the hollow gaze of that figure, they filled my mind, replaying over and over, as if they were burned into my memory. I closed my eyes, willing the images to fade, but they remained, lingering in the darkness, a reminder of the world I had glimpsed, a world that would haunt me for the rest of my days. In the weeks that followed, I tried to go about my life as usual, but the experience had left a scar, an invisible wound that refused to heal. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, my senses on high alert, as if I were expecting to see that figure lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. Even in crowded places, I felt the weight of their gaze, a presence that lingered just beyond my sight, a shadow that followed me wherever I went. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, I would hear it, the faint sound of whispers, drifting through the silence like a ghostly melody. I would lie there, listening, my heart racing, my mind filled with images of that stone circle, of the chanting that had filled the air, of the void that had stared into me and seen everything. And I would remember the old man's words, his warning that once you've been touched by them, there's no going back. And it's been years now, but the memory has never faded. I can still feel it, that darkness lurking just beneath the surface, waiting. And sometimes, when I'm alone, when the world is quiet and the shadows grow long, I can sense it, a whisper on the edge of my mind, a reminder of the night I wandered too far, the night I crossed into their world and found something that I was never meant to see. And though I have tried to put it behind me, to move on, I know that part of me will always be in those woods, standing in that stone circle, staring into the void, marked forever by the darkness that lives in the heart of the Irish wilderness.